The day a king chooses to stand in front of one ordinary woman instead of an entire kingdom is the day history changes forever. The polished marble floor of the Crimson Citadel reflected hundreds of crystal chandeliers, each one casting pale silver light across the silent royal court. Nobles dressed in black velvet and jeweled ceremonial robes stood shoulder to shoulder beneath towering stone pillars, their whispered conversations fading into uneasy silence as a single steel blade slowly rose and pointed toward Queen Evelyn Ashford. She didn't step back. She didn't argue. She simply stood there in a simple ivory gown that looked almost fragile against the overwhelming grandeur of the ancient hall, her steady breathing the only sign that she refused to surrender to fear. Around her, countless crimson eyes watched with cold curiosity. Some pitied her. Many expected her downfall. Others had waited months for this exact moment. After all, she wasn't born into vampire royalty. She wasn't descended from an immortal bloodline. She was simply human. Just 1 year earlier, Evelyn Carter had been working double shifts at a neighborhood bakery outside Boston, measuring flour before sunrise and carrying warm loaves to customers who barely remembered her name. She understood overdue rent, aching feet, and counting every dollar before grocery shopping. She had never imagined that kindness shown to a stranger during a snowstorm would someday place a royal crown upon her head. Yet fate had carried her farther than any dream ever dared. Now she stood beside the oldest throne in the vampire kingdom, wearing a title that many believed should never belong to someone with a human heartbeat. High above the court, enormous stained glass windows painted the chamber with deep shades of sapphire and crimson while banners bearing the royal crest hung perfectly still in the cold air. Every member of the royal council had arrived. Every influential vampire house had sent representatives. Even distant rulers from neighboring territories watched from elevated balconies, eager to witness whether the human queen would survive her first grand assembly. Evelyn understood exactly what their silent stares meant. They weren't looking at their queen. They were studying an outsider. Every movement she made would be judged. Every word she spoke would become another reason to question why the vampire king had chosen her above centuries of noble bloodlines. Earlier that morning, one elderly servant had quietly adjusted the silver clasp on Evelyn's cloak before whispering, "Your Majesty, kindness frightens cruel hearts more than power ever will." Those words lingered in Evelyn's mind as the enormous bronze doors slowly opened and another group of nobles entered with carefully rehearsed smiles. Their greetings sounded polite, but beneath every graceful bow rested hidden calculation. Somewhere inside this magnificent palace, someone had already decided that today's ceremony would not end peacefully. Evelyn could feel it in the unnatural silence, in the guarded expressions of the royal guards, and in the way conversations stopped each time she walked past. She lifted her chin anyway, choosing dignity over fear, unaware that before the sun disappeared beyond the castle towers, the entire kingdom would witness a decision from its immortal king that would forever redefine loyalty, marriage, and the true meaning of protection. 24 hours earlier, the palace had seemed almost peaceful. Morning sunlight filtered through towering stained glass windows, covering the eastern halls with ribbons of blue and gold that softened even the cold stone walls built centuries before Evelyn had been born. She walked quietly beside the palace gardens carrying a small basket filled with fresh herbs she had gathered herself instead of asking servants to do it for her. The gardeners smiled when she greeted them by name. The cooks thanked her for bringing herbs instead of issuing royal orders. Even the youngest stable worker stood a little taller after she remembered his birthday from a conversation weeks before. Those small moments meant everything to the people who served inside the Crimson Citadel. To the nobles, however, they meant weakness. More than one aristocrat watched from distant balconies with expressions carefully hidden behind polite smiles. They did not understand why a queen would carry her own basket or stop to help an elderly servant pick up scattered books after an accidental stumble. Royalty, in their eyes, was supposed to inspire distance. Evelyn inspired trust instead. That difference unsettled them far more than they cared to admit. Deep inside the western wing, whispers spread faster than footsteps. Members of influential vampire families gathered behind carved oak doors where no servants were permitted to enter. Crystal glasses rested untouched upon an ancient table while quiet voices exchanged carefully measured words. Some questioned the future of the kingdom. Others questioned the judgment of their king. A few simply feared change because change threatened traditions older than memory itself. Every conversation eventually returned to one name: Evelyn. Outside those hidden chambers, she remained completely unaware of how often her name echoed through the palace corridors. She spent the afternoon visiting the royal library, where dust floated through beams of sunlight and shelves stretched nearly 50 feet toward the painted ceiling. Instead of searching for books about royal history, she chose volumes describing the villages surrounding the kingdom. She wanted to understand the people whose lives had become connected to hers. An elderly librarian noticed her selections and smiled warmly before saying, "The greatest rulers always learn the names of ordinary people before they memorize the names of kings." Evelyn thanked him with genuine gratitude, never noticing another figure standing quietly behind one of the towering bookshelves. Lady Seraphine, one of the oldest noblewomen in the kingdom, observed every page Evelyn opened, every question she asked, every smile she offered. Her elegant expression never changed, yet something colder than winter settled inside her crimson eyes. By sunset, invitations for the Grand Assembly had already reached every noble household. Officially, the gathering celebrated unity between ancient vampire houses. Unofficially, it would become the perfect stage to measure whether a human queen truly belonged beside the immortal throne. As evening settled over the palace, Evelyn stood alone near the enormous eastern balcony overlooking miles of forest glowing beneath the fading light. She drew a slow breath, believing tomorrow would simply be another formal ceremony filled with unfamiliar customs. Far below, the palace bells rang once, then twice, their echoes disappearing into the gathering darkness. Somewhere beyond the silent halls, unseen hands had already begun arranging every piece of a dangerous game, and by the time the first guest crossed the palace gates the following morning, the trap waiting for the human queen would already be impossible to escape. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished silver, and before the first rays of sunlight touched the towers of the Crimson Citadel, elegant carriages had already begun climbing the winding road toward the royal palace. One after another they stopped beneath towering stone arches as vampire nobles stepped onto crimson carpets wearing expressions of flawless courtesy that concealed ambitions far older than the kingdom itself. Inside the Grand Assembly Hall, musicians performed a slow ceremonial melody while attendants welcomed honored guests with crystal goblets filled with dark ruby-colored wine. Every greeting sounded warm. Every smile appeared sincere. Yet beneath the polished manners, invisible currents of suspicion flowed through the room like winter air slipping beneath a locked door. Evelyn entered quietly beside several royal attendants, her ivory gown catching the morning light without the excessive jewels favored by the noble families surrounding her. She wore only the simple silver crown King Lucian had personally placed upon her head during their wedding ceremony, believing dignity never required extravagance. Several younger servants smiled when they saw her, but many nobles exchanged silent glances that lingered just a little too long. Lady Seraphine watched from the center of the gathering with graceful confidence before stepping forward as though welcoming an old friend. "Your Majesty," she said with effortless warmth, "there is an ancient royal blessing performed before every grand assembly. Every queen before you has participated. I would be honored to guide you through the tradition." Evelyn offered a grateful smile. She had spent months studying vampire customs, yet countless ceremonies remained unfamiliar. Refusing guidance would appear disrespectful, so she accepted without hesitation. Lady Seraphine led her through a series of magnificent corridors until they reached a circular chamber where an ancient crystal relic rested upon a marble pedestal surrounded by engraved symbols worn smooth by centuries. Candles flickered without wind. The room felt strangely quiet. "Simply place your hand upon the crystal of sovereign harmony," Lady Seraphine explained gently. "It welcomes every queen into the memory of the kingdom." Evelyn hesitated only for a heartbeat before resting her fingertips against the cool surface. Nothing happened. Then, without warning, brilliant crimson light burst from deep inside the crystal. Gasps echoed across the chamber as hidden doors opened and council members hurried inside from every direction as though they had been waiting nearby all along. The glowing relic pulsed again, brighter this time, filling the room with scarlet reflections that danced across the ancient walls. Confused whispers immediately spread among the assembled nobles. One elderly council member stared at the crystal with widening eyes before declaring in a trembling voice, "The relic has reacted. The sacred balance has been disturbed." Another noble stepped forward and pointed directly toward Evelyn. "The ceremony has been violated." More voices quickly joined together, each sounding more certain than the last. "The human queen has awakened forbidden energy. The omen cannot be ignored. Royal law demands an inquiry." Evelyn slowly withdrew her hand, her heartbeat quickening as she searched the faces surrounding her. None offered reassurance. Even the attendants who had accompanied her looked frightened, uncertain whether they were allowed to speak. Lady Seraphine lowered her eyes with carefully measured disappointment, hiding the faint satisfaction that briefly crossed her face before anyone else could notice. Across the chamber the ancient crystal continued glowing with unnatural intensity, and although Evelyn had done nothing except follow instructions, every eye in the room had already decided exactly who was responsible. Within minutes the circular chamber transformed into something entirely different from the quiet ceremonial room Evelyn had entered only moments before. Additional council members streamed through the ancient doors while royal scribes hurried to their assigned places, recording every word that would soon become part of the kingdom's permanent history. The brilliant crimson light inside the crystal finally faded, yet the heavy silence it left behind seemed even more unsettling. Evelyn remained where she stood, resisting the growing temptation to defend herself before she fully understood what had happened. She knew one careless sentence could become another weapon placed in someone else's hands. Across the chamber, Lady Seraphine slowly approached the marble pedestal with graceful confidence. Her fingertips hovered just above the ancient relic without touching it. "I have witnessed this ceremony for more than 3 centuries, she said softly, allowing every person in the room to hear her measured voice. Never has the crystal of sovereign harmony responded in such a manner. Her words were calm. That made them even more dangerous. One council elder nodded solemnly before opening an enormous leather-bound volume resting upon a carved stone table. Dust drifted into the air as fragile pages revealed centuries of carefully preserved royal law. He adjusted his spectacles and began reading in a voice that echoed throughout the chamber. When the sacred crystal rejects harmony, the royal council must immediately determine whether the disturbance threatens the balance of the kingdom. The sentence settled over the gathering like an approaching storm. Several nobles exchanged meaningful glances. Others quietly stepped farther away from Evelyn, as though distance alone could prove their loyalty. A younger council member pointed toward the fading glow within the crystal. "The evidence speaks for itself," he declared. The disturbance began the moment the human queen placed her hand upon the relic. Murmurs swept across the chamber. Evelyn lifted her head and answered with steady composure. "I only followed the instructions that were given to me." Her voice remained calm despite the uncertainty tightening inside her chest. "I intended nothing except to honor your tradition." For the briefest moment, absolute silence returned. Then Lady Seraphine sighed almost regretfully. "No one questions your Majesty's intentions," she replied with practiced sympathy. "Intentions and consequences are not always the same." The sentence spread through the room with astonishing speed. Several nobles quietly repeated it to one another until it sounded less like an opinion and more like established truth. Evelyn suddenly realized the discussion had shifted. They were no longer asking whether she had done anything wrong. They were deciding how responsible she should be. The great bronze doors opened once again as Captain Rowan Graves entered with a small group of royal guards dressed in polished black armor trimmed with silver. He paused immediately after seeing the assembled council. His eyes briefly met Evelyn's, and uncertainty crossed his face. He had sworn loyalty to the crown itself, yet now the council expected him to enforce their authority before the king had even returned to the palace. "Captain," the eldest council member said firmly, "until this inquiry concludes, the human queen must remain within the Grand Assembly Hall under royal observation according to ancient procedure." Rowan hesitated. Every guard behind him remained perfectly still, waiting for his command. Evelyn looked from the captain to the council surrounding her and finally understood the trap had been carefully prepared long before she entered the chamber. She had not been invited to participate in an ancient tradition. She had been guided directly into a test that someone had expected her to fail, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, the one person whose voice could stop everything had not yet returned. Captain Rowan Graves remained motionless, his gloved hands resting behind his back while the weight of the royal council settled heavily across the chamber. Every instinct urged him to defend the woman who had treated every palace servant with kindness, yet every oath he had ever sworn demanded obedience to the laws of the kingdom until the king himself returned. The conflict was written plainly across his face, and the nobles noticed it immediately. "You hesitate, Captain," one council elder observed. "The law should never create hesitation." Rowan answered carefully. "The law also teaches patience before judgment." His measured response prevented immediate confrontation, but it satisfied no one. Around the chamber, influential nobles quietly gathered into small circles, speaking in voices barely above whispers. Some argued that the unusual reaction of the crystal proved the kingdom faced an unknown danger. Others insisted that removing the human queen from public life would calm growing unrest among the ancient houses. A few remained silent, watching the conversation unfold while calculating which outcome would strengthen their own influence. None of them spoke directly to Evelyn. They spoke about her as though she were already absent. Standing near the marble pedestal, Evelyn folded her hands calmly before her, refusing to allow fear to control her expression. She remembered every lesson she had learned since entering the palace. A queen represented more than herself. Every action reflected upon the crown. If she surrendered to panic, those searching for weakness would claim victory without ever proving a single accusation. Lady Seraphine slowly approached the council table once more. "The Grand Assembly begins within the hour," she said with composed authority. "Thousands will soon gather inside the Hall of Sovereigns. If rumors spread before we establish control, uncertainty may reach every noble family in attendance." Another council member nodded immediately. "Then the human queen should not appear before the assembly until this matter is resolved." Several voices agreed at once. The proposal traveled through the chamber with alarming speed, collecting support from nearly every influential house. One elder carefully closed the ancient law book before speaking again. "We do not pronounce guilt. We merely preserve order while the inquiry continues." The distinction sounded reasonable, yet Evelyn understood its true purpose. If she disappeared before the ceremony, the kingdom would not remember careful legal language. They would remember only that the human queen had been removed from public view on the very morning of the Grand Assembly. Reputation could be damaged without anyone ever speaking a lie. Suddenly the massive palace bells echoed through the corridors, announcing the arrival of another royal delegation. The sound rolled across the stone walls like distant thunder before fading into silence. Every face in the chamber turned toward the closed bronze doors. For one hopeful moment, Evelyn wondered whether Lucian had returned earlier than expected. Instead, a royal messenger hurried inside, bowed respectfully, and addressed the council. "His Majesty's escort has crossed the northern mountains," he announced. "Unexpected conditions have delayed the royal procession. The king is still several hours from the capital." The chamber became perfectly still. Lady Seraphine lowered her eyes to conceal the satisfaction hidden beneath her graceful smile. Several nobles exchanged relieved glances. They now possessed something they had not expected to receive that morning: time. And in a palace where appearances often became accepted truth long before facts could catch up, a few carefully managed hours were more than enough to reshape the fate of an innocent queen. The Hall of Sovereigns filled with quiet anticipation as thousands of distinguished guests took their places beneath towering vaulted ceilings carved with the history of every royal dynasty. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead while musicians lowered their instruments, sensing that something unexpected had already unsettled the carefully planned ceremony. Word traveled through the gathering without anyone raising a voice. The human queen had not appeared. Some believed she had fallen ill. Others whispered that the royal council had uncovered an ancient violation. With every passing minute, uncertainty spread farther than truth. Behind the great bronze doors leading into the assembly, Evelyn remained under formal observation, surrounded not by chains but by silence. Captain Rowan Graves stood only a few feet away, refusing to leave his post even though he disliked every moment of the situation. He watched the council members moving between private conversations, each one speaking with increasing confidence as though the outcome had already been decided. Evelyn quietly studied the room instead. She noticed how no one asked new questions anymore. They repeated the same conclusions in different words until doubt slowly transformed into certainty. That frightened her more than any accusation. Lady Seraphine finally stepped toward the center of the chamber and addressed the assembled council. For the stability of the kingdom, she announced, the Grand Assembly shall proceed without the presence of the human queen until this inquiry reaches its conclusion. Several elders nodded immediately. Another signed the recommendation into the official record. One by one, influential nobles voiced their approval. The decision appeared unanimous, but Captain Rowan noticed that many remained silent rather than supportive. They simply feared standing against the growing tide. Before another declaration could be recorded, a deep sound rolled through the palace. It was not the ceremonial bell. It was the ancient royal horn, a signal heard only when the sovereign entered the capital. Every conversation stopped. Every noble instinctively turned toward the towering entrance of the Hall of Sovereigns. Outside, footsteps echoed across polished stone with calm, measured confidence. The massive doors slowly opened without announcement. Cold mountain air drifted into the hall, carrying the faint scent of rain. Standing within the doorway was King Lucian Ashford. His black ceremonial coat bore traces of the long journey, yet nothing about his posture suggested fatigue. His silver crown reflected the chandelier light while his pale face remained unreadable. He surveyed the chamber once, saying nothing. The silence became almost unbearable. Council members who had spoken so confidently only moments earlier now lowered their eyes. Captain Rowan immediately bowed. Palace guards followed. Then servants. Then visiting nobles. A wave of respect spread across the hall until nearly everyone stood with lowered heads. Lucian did not acknowledge the ceremony. Instead, his gaze moved beyond the council and rested entirely upon Evelyn. She had not spoken his name. She had not called for help. Yet one brief look was enough. He noticed the untouched royal record resting upon the council table. He noticed the fading crimson glow still trapped inside the ancient crystal. He noticed the distance the nobles had deliberately placed between themselves and his queen. Without asking a single question or waiting for a single explanation, Lucian walked forward with calm, unhurried steps until he stood beside Evelyn. Then, in complete silence, he positioned himself between her and the entire royal council, leaving no doubt where the king of the vampire kingdom had chosen to stand. No one spoke. Even the endless whisper of the chandeliers seemed to disappear as King Lucian Ashford stood before the royal council with Evelyn just behind his shoulder. His expression revealed nothing, yet the quiet authority surrounding him pressed upon the chamber with greater force than any raised voice ever could. The elders who had confidently quoted ancient law only moments before now avoided meeting his eyes. Lucian slowly looked across every face gathered before him, giving each council member the unmistakable feeling that nothing inside the hall had escaped his notice. At last he broke the silence. "Present your accusation." His voice was calm, measured, and impossible to ignore. The eldest council member stepped forward, carefully holding the ancient volume of royal law. Your Majesty, during the ceremonial blessing, the crystal of sovereign harmony reacted in an unprecedented manner immediately after Her Majesty touched the relic. According to tradition, we have initiated a lawful inquiry to preserve the stability of the kingdom. Lucian listened without interruption. When the elder finished speaking, the king shifted his attention toward the crystal resting upon the marble pedestal. The last traces of crimson light still shimmered beneath its polished surface. He walked forward alone, placed one hand gently against the ancient relic, and closed his eyes for only a brief moment. The chamber waited in complete silence. When Lucian opened his eyes again, he turned toward the council with the faintest trace of disappointment rather than anger. "You recognized the reaction," he said quietly. "But you failed to recognize its meaning." Confused murmurs spread through the nobles. Lady Seraphine remained perfectly composed, though her fingers tightened almost invisibly around the sleeve of her ceremonial robe. Lucian motioned toward Captain Rowan Graves. "Bring me the Royal Archive of Blood Covenants." Rowan bowed immediately and disappeared through a side entrance before returning moments later carrying an elegant ebony case secured with silver locks bearing the royal crest. The king opened it himself and removed a weathered parchment protected beneath crystal glass. The document looked older than the palace itself. Gold lettering shimmered across the faded surface as though untouched by time. Lucian raised the ancient covenant high enough for the entire chamber to see. "This decree was written by the first vampire king nearly 1,000 years ago," he announced. "It has never been repealed, challenged, or replaced." Several council elders exchanged uneasy glances. They recognized the seal immediately but could not remember the exact wording preserved within the forgotten covenant. Lucian began reading aloud. "From the hour the sacred bond is completed, the chosen royal spouse shall stand beneath the direct protection of the sovereign. No council, no noble house, and no authority shall separate judgment from the crown. Whoever seeks to condemn the royal spouse without the king's presence rejects not merely the queen but the authority of the throne itself." Silence followed every word. The realization spread across the chamber one face at a time. The inquiry had never truly possessed legal authority. By assembling the investigation before the king's return, the council had unknowingly violated one of the oldest protections ever established within the kingdom. Lucian carefully returned the covenant to its case before facing the nobles once more. "You believed you were testing my queen," he said. "In truth, you have tested your own loyalty to the crown." For the first time since the mourning began, uncertainty shifted away from Evelyn and settled squarely upon those who had orchestrated the entire accusation. The silence that followed the ancient covenant felt heavier than every accusation that had echoed through the palace that morning. No council member rushed to defend the inquiry. No noble attempted another interpretation of the law. The forgotten decree had spoken with unmistakable clarity, and every person standing inside the Hall of Sovereigns understood that the foundation beneath their carefully constructed arguments had disappeared. King Lucian Ashford slowly closed the ebony case and handed it back to Captain Rowan Graves before turning toward the Royal Council once more. His expression remained composed, neither triumphant nor angry. That calm unsettled the nobles far more than fury ever could. "The purpose of law," Lucian said evenly, "is to protect justice, not to disguise ambition." His words carried across the vast chamber without effort. Every servant, every guard, and every visiting dignitary heard them with perfect clarity. The eldest council member lowered his head. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "our intention was to preserve stability." Lucian answered before the explanation could continue. "Stability built upon suspicion cannot endure. A kingdom remains strong only when its laws are applied without prejudice." His gaze moved slowly across the assembled nobles until it rested upon Lady Seraphine. She stood with flawless posture, yet the confidence that had guided her throughout the morning had quietly faded. "Lady Seraphine," the king continued, "you personally guided the queen to the ancient relic." She bowed respectfully. "I believed I was honoring tradition, Your Majesty." Lucian regarded her for a long moment before speaking again. Tradition without honesty becomes manipulation. The chamber fell silent once more. Although he offered no harsh condemnation, everyone understood the weight of his words. The king then turned toward Evelyn for the first time since entering the hall. She met his eyes with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the entire ordeal. She had never demanded rescue. She had never pleaded for special treatment. She had simply trusted that truth would eventually find its place. Lucian gave the slightest nod before facing the assembly again. "The inquiry is concluded," he declared. "All allegations against the Queen are withdrawn immediately. Every official record created during these proceedings shall be corrected to reflect that no violation occurred." Royal scribes instantly began rewriting the documents spread across the council table. Captain Rowan supervised the removal of the incomplete investigation from the official archive while palace attendants carefully carried away the temporary notices that had been prepared for the Grand Assembly. The atmosphere inside the hall shifted almost visibly. Visiting rulers who had watched the proceedings from distant balconies exchanged thoughtful glances. They had witnessed more than a legal dispute. They had witnessed a king place fairness above political convenience. One by one, the council elders stepped forward and bowed respectfully toward Evelyn. Their gestures were not theatrical. They were formal acknowledgments that the human queen stood under the full dignity of the crown. Even Lady Seraphine lowered her head with measured grace, offering the courtesy that royal law now unmistakably required. Around the chamber, countless nobles followed until an extraordinary sight unfolded beneath the crystal chandeliers. The same gathering that had questioned whether a human belonged beside the throne now stood in respectful silence before her. Evelyn did not smile with victory, nor did she show resentment. She simply returned each gesture with quiet grace, understanding that true respect earned through integrity would always endure longer than fear, while somewhere deep within the ancient palace walls, unseen eyes continued watching events unfold, already preparing a challenge far greater than anything the royal council had imagined. That evening, the Crimson Citadel stood beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, its towering spires rising above endless forests that stretched toward the distant mountains. The celebrations of the Grand Assembly had finally come to an end, and one by one the visiting nobles departed through the great palace gates carrying stories that would travel far beyond the borders of the vampire kingdom. Yet none of them spoke only about ancient laws or forgotten covenants. They spoke about the human queen who had answered suspicion with dignity, and about the immortal king who had placed justice above politics without raising his voice. Inside the palace, the endless corridors had grown quiet once again. Candlelight flickered gently against polished stone walls as Evelyn walked beside Lucian through the western gallery overlooking the moonlit gardens. Neither of them hurried. Neither felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. At last Evelyn looked toward him with a gentle smile. "You already knew the covenant before you entered the hall, did you not?" Lucian returned her gaze, his pale face softened by an expression few people had ever witnessed. "I knew the law," he answered. "I did not know who had chosen to ignore it." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. "I was afraid, but I never doubted you." Lucian stopped beside one of the towering windows overlooking the kingdom below. Thousands of warm lights shimmered across distant villages where ordinary families finished their evening meals without realizing how close the kingdom had come to allowing fear to outweigh fairness. "A crown is not measured by the power it commands," Lucian said quietly. "It is measured by the people it refuses to abandon." Evelyn listened without answering. She understood those words were not spoken only for her. They were the promise of a ruler who believed that every life beneath his protection deserved equal dignity, whether born into ancient nobility or an ordinary home. Far below the palace, bells rang softly to mark the arrival of midnight. Their peaceful echoes drifted through the valley before disappearing into the cool night air. At that very moment, deep beneath the oldest foundation of the Crimson Citadel, hidden beyond passages forgotten by nearly every generation, a circular chamber remained sealed behind enormous stone doors carved with symbols older than the kingdom itself. Without warning, Faint silver light slowly spread across the ancient walls. Dust that had rested undisturbed for centuries gently lifted into the air as glowing letters emerged one after another across the weathered stone. An elderly guardian who had watched over the forgotten sanctuary for decades stared in silent disbelief. No one had entered. No hand had touched the walls. Yet the ancient prophecy awakened on its own. The final line shone brighter than all the others. When the heart of the immortal throne chooses kindness above blood, the future of the kingdom shall rest within the hands of the human queen. The old guardian quietly closed his eyes before whispering a single sentence meant only for himself. It has begun. Above him, Evelyn stood beside Lucian beneath the peaceful night sky, completely unaware that the greatest challenge awaiting them would not come from jealous nobles or forgotten traditions. It would come from a destiny written long before either of them had taken their first breath. And sometimes, the quietest act of kindness becomes the strongest force that changes an entire world forever.